Guys, how's it going? Hope you guys are doing well today. Today we are back with Soul and Tongues. It's been a while. So yeah, I don't have too much to say. My day's been pretty easy. Just had one class, and it was my acting class, and how it goes. You do be acting, but hope you guys' day are going well, and yeah. So today we're continuing to read Soul and Tongues. Those of you who are watching this for the first time, whether this be on YouTube or on Twitch, I highly recommend going to watch the previous readings from my Stolen Tongue streams before watching this, because you might be kind of confused. So go check those out. They're in a playlist on my YouTube channel, linked in my About section here on Twitch. So yeah, we're gonna hop right into it. Honestly, there's not much to say besides let's get into it. Yeah, so I'm gonna hop on over to my spooky music and then hop over to my scary stories section here. We're gonna hop right in, guys. So here we go. Oh, and I always forget to remind this. After each page, I will be stopping to read chat, but I won't be reading chat in the middle of a page. So just to let you guys know, so we don't take you out of the story as much. Back at home, Faye napped a while on the couch. She seemed more comfortable sleeping downstairs than in our room, probably because she had come to associate our bed with all the awful things plaguing her mind. While she was asleep, a strange thought occurred to me. The child she thought she heard today, was it a memory of the little boy that sang and babbled in the darkness outside the cabin? I tried to recall some of his phrases. Burn up the hags, rock-a-bye baby, and the treetop, and when do we go inside? When do we go inside? The terrible way he spoke, the simultaneity, oh my gosh, that is a word, of joy and emptiness in his head, painted with a gruesome picture in my head. I imagined a little boy in an archaic school uniform standing in the snow outside of the cabin on Pale Peak. His eyes had been gouged out, leaving behind a darkness that yawned from their sockets. Despite his blindness, he stared out of the cabin with a knowing gaze, cheerfully practicing songs and phrases most likely he didn't understand. He was a hollowed-out thing, a desperate mockery of a person. The child's voice reminded me of what Faye had said about the man digging holes in her dreams. They both felt singularly inhuman. I shook the image from my mind, but could not shake the darker thought that replaced it. What if the phrase, "When do we go inside?" didn't refer to the cabin at all? Perhaps instead it referred to Faye herself. I glanced over at her from my chair, watching her chest rise and fall. I wondered when her mysterious visitor would reveal himself again, and what he would ask her this time. Faye was hungry when she woke up. She insisted we get away from the house and go out to eat. I obliged, hopeful that being around other people might help her to snap out of the particular mood she'd been suffering. She chose her favorite steak joint, Bucky's Smokehouse. There, Faye always orders the same thing and calls it her death row meal, a barbecue chicken sandwich with macaroni and cheese and a glass bottle of Coca-Cola. It's the only soda she'll drink. In fact, her blood is mostly Coke. On the ride over, Faye again withdrew into herself and barely spoke to me. Instead, she hummed that familiar song, but I couldn't remember where I'd heard it before. When I asked what it was, she said she didn't realize she'd been humming anything, and probably made it up. At the restaurant, things got even weirder. Faye gulped down 2 huge glasses of water and said nothing to the waiter about Coke, then proceeded to order a New York strip, as rare as you can make it. Just wave it over the fire. I asked if she could order for me, too, pretending to take a call on my cell phone, but she appeared to have forgotten that I always order the ribs. I reminded her, then decided to test her further. "Do you still think about the cabin?" I asked, fiddling with my phone. "Not really," she replied vacantly. "You? What do you remember about the last time you were there?" A bit of anger flashed in her eyes. "You've been fucking interrogating me ever since we left," she snapped. I feel like I'm in trial all the time. I was caught off guard by her reaction. I'm sorry, was all I could muster. What do you want from me? She added. Really, it was awful. I think about it every gosh darn day, even when I'm asleep, and I don't want to talk about it. She took another big gulp of water. It dribbled down her chin. I'm just worried is all. You've been acting funny. I'm fine. Worry about yourself. An awkward silence fell. It was Faye's nature to be very protective of her inner thoughts and feelings. The entire first year of our relationship felt like an epic quest to win her heart. I would leap one wall only to find another beyond it. Dating her was a bit like the old fairy tale about the knight who scaled the highest mountain, except in this story, the damsel had to rescue him. I had nearly given up on my quest for Faye's love when she at last said those 3 words and told me I'd earned it. For the past several days, however, she was unusually defensive, even for her. It wasn't just her sleep disturbances that were bothering me. Lately, nothing about her behavior felt familiar. I tried a different angle, hoping to find a weak spot in her armor. Babe, did anything like this happen when you were at the cabin before? Faye eyed me suspiciously, but she restrained herself from another outburst. What do you mean? Well, you went there once when you were 14, right? Why did it take you 12 years to go back? She took another few gulps of water. I've never been to the cabin before in my life. A steaming plate of barbecued ribs moved in front of my face. The waiter put our food down and asked us if we needed anything, but I was too baffled to respond. He picked up on the mood at the table and immediately left. I watched in awe as Faye wolfed down her steak and chased it with glass after glass of water, never once looking up at me or indicating that she was aware of her surrounding whatsoever. We ate in silence. On the walk back to the car, I put an arm around her waist and noticed all of her muscles were tense. When I pulled her close and said, I love you, Noodle, Faye smiled dismissively and nodded. You still like it when I call you Noodle? I asked, sliding my hand down to her butt. I stuffed my fingers into one of her back pockets and squeezed. Of course, she replied. But I had never called her that before. The only nickname I'd ever given her was Monkey Toes because of the unusual dexterity of her feet. Faye had earned the nickname at the beginning of our relationship when I saw her use a foot to pluck the TV remote from the ground and deftly channel surf with her toes. Conversely, I'd earned the shameful moniker Pop-Tart when she caught me shoving the chocolate pastries into my mouth under the cover of darkness one night. My little tests throughout the evening did not convince me that Faye had been kidnapped by the body snatchers and replaced with an evil duplicate. She still felt like Faye, at least some of the time. It was important to me to try to maintain some measure of skepticism. If I put a stock in the idea that a ghost had followed us home from Pale Peak, it might cloud my judgment during an emergency. But I found myself vacillating, help me, I'm struggling today, between logical and spiritual explanations for disturbing behavior, and recognized my skepticism eroded a little more each day. It felt like part of Faye was disappearing. It was as if she would go somewhere else, as we might in a dream, leaving her body behind in the process. She wandered far away, and each time she came back, she returned with less and less of herself. Each time she returned, she brought more of someone else back with her, the one who calls out to her from her nightmares. Whoever was whispering to Faye at night, whoever was prowling around outside the cabin of our home, I could feel him now too. Faye would notice if I called her Noodle. Faye would remember her favorite drink, and Faye would put 5 across my eyes if I ever grabbed her ass in public. When we got home, I headed upstairs to finish writing a paper. Faye cracked open one of the Cokes from her stash in the fridge, then collapsed on the couch and scrolled through Facebook and her phone. Her weird mood had vanished the moment she'd walked into the house. As I worked, Faye's gentle humming drifted upstairs. The song was hypnotic and familiar. It resonated inside my head and drove me crazy. Eventually, I began humming along, and the words formed on my lips and hung in the air. Soul mia do, naked soul mia do. The lecture I was writing turned into gibberish. A warm fuzziness spread around the back of my head and weighed down my eyelids. Sleep dragged me downward into its narcotic abyss, and the last thing I heard was that wicked song. But not from my mouth or face. It seemed to come from outside. Cackling laughter jerked me from unconsciousness. Warm air blew up against my face from the laptop. I passed out with my head on the desk. Something moved behind me, something scraping against the carpet, like a big dog tearing across the floor at dinner time. I spun around in the chair and peered into the darkness of the hallway, but failed to locate the source of the noise. There was a faint ray of light cutting toward the staircase. It came from beneath our bedroom door at the end of the hall. I walked past the stairs and pushed that door open, but Faye was not in bed. The sheets were neat and untouched, so I assumed she was still watching a movie downstairs. As I turned to leave, an inky form clambered up from the staircase and into the hallway, then moved into the spare room where I'd been working. The thing skittered like a human-sized spider, each limb moving independently and jutting from a rigid body. I nearly screamed as it darted across the periphery of my vision, but I found the courage to walk after it. The spare room's light glowed against the blackness of the hall. My hand shook so hard that I couldn't find the hall light switch. As I desperately ran my fingers up and down the wall, a head emerged from the doorway. From knee level, it peered up at me sideways with a malicious grin. The harsh light coming from inside that room threw ugly shadows across its face, and it took me a moment to realize what I was looking at. It was Faye. She was crawling around on the floor, laughing and smiling with her eyes rolled back in her head. She gurgled and hacked a clot of phlegm from her throat, then stuck her tongue out and flicked it around, mouthing words I couldn't begin to understand. "Faye?" I called. "What the fuck are you doing?" She loosed a wet cough, then dashed out from the room and zigzagged her way toward me. Her arms and legs flailed wildly in exaggerated lunges, and her head rolled about like a bowl on a stick. "Someone's at the door," she hissed, laughing as she snaked past me into our bedroom. "Knock, knock." I watched as Faye ducked into the bathroom. The house fell eerily silent. "Faye," I said in a stern voice. "Wake up." She didn't respond. The bathroom door sat ajar, allowing a beam of light from the bedroom to penetrate. A single bare foot rested in the glow, its toes curled and tapped rhythmically against the floor. Slow, heavy breathing rose in volume as I approached the door. "Babe?" The door squealed as I nudged it with my palm. The beam of light expanded into the dark, illuminating an eerie scene. Faye stood between the toilet and the bathtub, clenching her fists over and over. Her toes wiggled. She swayed gently to and fro. Her eyes were now shut, but she still appeared to see everything in front of her, and watched intently as I stepped into the bathroom with her. "Tell them," she whispered. It took a moment for my eyes to adjust, but I could now see tears dribbling from her eyelashes. "Tell them what, Faye?" "To leave." Just as the words left her mouth, there came a gentle knock, knock, knock from far off in the house. We'd only been living here for a year, but I knew all of its creaks and squeaks intimately because of how much time I'd spent working from home. There really was someone at the front door. Baffled, I looked over my shoulder, then back at Faye. How long had someone been standing out there? "There's a man at the door," she continued, clenching her jaw as she spoke. Her eyes rolled around behind the lids, indicating that she was dreaming. "He whispered to me while you were upstairs. Been doing it for hours. Wants to know your name. Tell him, and he'll go away." Pure rage blurred my vision. I turned to leave, wanting to punish the son of a bitch once and for all, but then halted in my tracks. "Faye," I said, looking back. "What do you mean, them?" "Who else is here?" She rolled her head again, the bones in her neck crunched. "There's a woman at the bottom of the stairs." A surge of masculinity that compelled me vanished as quickly as it had struck. I cautiously exited the room and made my way into the hallway, peering over the low wall that overlooked the bottom floor. The way the gloom hung in the air, the way the frail moonlight seeped in through the curtains like a silvery sludge, cast the room in a grid of light and dark patches. Wedged into the far corner between a wall and the bookcase, there stood a dusky figure, trapped in place by a blade of pale light that stabbed through the window. It looked like the slender form of a woman clutching herself in the cold. "Who's there?" I demanded as bravely as I could. "Who's in my house?" I could hardly focus my eyes in the soupy darkness, and not at all when I looked directly at the figure. Adrenaline electrified me now, and I charged to the light switch at the staircase, throwing it on and bull-rushing down the living room. Nausea overwhelmed me as I reached the bottom of the stairs. It was the same feeling I had that had overcome me at Colin's house all those years ago, when Carrot the parrot tried to warn me about someone lurking around in the dark. The air thickened and soured, and as I pressed into it, the bile inside me washed up into my throat. The couch and table and stairs looped around me in a dizzying whirl, and I nearly lost my balance. The figure seemed to move toward me, but I struggled to keep sight of it. I withdrew from the living room and stumbled into the hall that led to the front door. A plume of cold air drifted past me, drawing my attention back to the doorway. There came another knock, this time louder. "Hello?" A voice called from behind the door. It sounded familiar, but in my nauseous daze, I couldn't place it. "Who the fuck are you?" I growled, leaning against the wall to stabilize myself. "What do you want?" The man outside knocked again. "Who are you?" I shouted. "Hello?" he asked again. The words sounded identical to the first time he said it, as though it were on a recording loop. Nothing in his voice indicated that he'd heard me at all. Finally, my legs found the strength to take me to the last few steps to the door. As I reached for the knob, a voice echoed behind me. "What's going on, Felix?" I rolled around to see Faye, awake and scared, standing at the bottom of the stairs. Her eyes were open, and a disoriented fear emanated from them. She had no idea what she had done minutes earlier. I ignored her and yanked the door open, inviting a rush of crisp night air. There was no one on our walkway, but the faint sound of leaves crunching drew my attention to the little grove across the street. Someone was walking through it, away from our neighborhood. I slammed the door and stormed around the house, flipping on lights and searching for the dark figure. I hadn't had a good night's sleep in days, or maybe weeks. I couldn't even remember anymore. The tendrils of insanity were slowly wrapping themselves around my neck, squeezing off the blood to my brain. "You're taking the damn sleeping pills," I said, staring at Faye. I snatched the bottle off the counter and shoved them into her hands. "Now." A few days passed, thankfully without any strange activity that night. The sleeping pills Dr. Farmer prescribed appeared to be working, and allowed both of us to get some desperately needed rest. During the day, Faye's anti-anxiety medication softened her up quite a bit. She came home from work each evening looking serene, and after dinner she busied herself sketching and writing in a dream journal she'd made from one of my notebooks. Of all the strange and horrible things that had been happening to us over the past few weeks, one thing kept returning to disquiet my mind. Up on Pale Peak, Faye told me she'd only visited the cabin once when she was 14, but a few days ago she told me she'd never been there before. I assumed she'd made the statement out of frustration as a bit to stop me from discussing our trip any further. Faye was trying to process everything that had happened in her own way, and each time I pressed her for answers, it churned the well of those ghastly memories. She just wanted them to settle. But I had never known Faye to be a liar. Now, because of her capricious and vacant demeanor, I wasn't sure anything that came out of her mouth was true. I wasn't even sure she was still entirely Faye. So, I did the only thing I could do. I called her Mom. Lynn was just as disingenuous a person as I'd ever met. I tended to group people into two groups, one that values politeness over honesty and the other exact opposite. Faye's mother was doubtlessly a member of the former and would go to great lengths of insincerity to avoid telling the truth, if the truth were inconvenient, hurtful, or scary. Thankfully, she was also the type of person who is addicted to her smartphone, so she called me less than a minute after I sent her text saying, "Hey, can we talk?" What's going on? She demanded before I could even say hello. Is Faye all right? I hesitated to tell her much of anything, for fear that it would give her a heart attack, but I realized that if I wanted her to be honest with me, I needed to be honest with her. She's gotten worse, I said flatly. She's been sleepwalking and saying really weird stuff almost every night. She talks about a man. This is going to sound crazy, but I swear I've seen him. Lynn struggled to conceal the sorrow in her voice. She tried to tell me that we were both exhausted and sleep-deprived, and that the mind can only put up with so much stress before it starts to break. Lynn, I said, fed up with her evasions, I really need you to cut the crap, for your daughter's sake. Is there anything you're not telling us that we should know? She exhaled hard into the receiver. Well, no, not that I can think of. Faye can't get her story straight about how many times she's been up at the cabin. I thought you might be able to clarify. My tone came out a bit bossier than intended, but Lynn seemed to respond to direct pressure. What did she tell you? Don't worry about that, I said. I just want to hear it from you. She hesitated for a moment. And don't lie, I added, or else I'll know. I had no idea where the words came from and cringed as soon as they left my mouth. We used to take her up there all the time, Lynn said, almost an admission. Took her snowshoeing and stuff. She loved the snow. She was just going into high school the last time she went up. I glanced out the kitchen window, trying to see if Faye was home yet from work. Between her whimsical changes in mood and her mother's penchant for sugarcoating everything, I couldn't tell which of them was the liar. Perhaps they both were. But why would they deceive me over something so trivial? What were they hiding? Well, thank you, I said, unwilling to carry on any further. This has been helpful. Not long after the conversation with Lynn, I received another call. It was Tuay. He immediately apologized for not contacting me sooner. We spoke briefly about Faye's condition, and he was disheartened to hear her behavior had grown more erratic. In the same fashion as the first time we spoke, Tuay eluded my questions. Instead, he made a few of his own. This time, he made no jokes. Is there any way you guys can make it back out there? He asked. Are you kidding? I replied, choking back on a string of curses. There's no way. That's an expensive trip, and Faye would sooner chain herself to the door. What about you? He persisted. His voice was grave. I could tell he wouldn't ask if it wasn't important. Could you find a way? I was stunned at the request. Going back to Pale Peak was the last thing on earth I wanted to do, but the urgency in his voice actually made me consider it. I couldn't leave Faye here. Not like this. It's been a few days, but you should see the way she gets. Tuay. I can't even describe it. The only thing keeping her down right now is medication, and that's gonna run out any day now. Doc only gave us a week's worth. Tuay paused for a long time, then sighed. You guys aren't the only ones who've been through something like this. It's rare, but you're not the first. What do you mean? I asked. There are things about this mountain that my people don't fully understand. I think waiting around isn't going to fix your problem, Felix. You guys did something up there, or something happened to you, and I think it can only be undone here. All the others who have left the mountain, the ones who ran away, it finds them in the end. The urge to hurl my phone at the wall swept over me. I let it pass. What is it, Tuay? Faye talks to him in her sleep. I see him outside my house, maybe even inside. Tell me what we're dealing with here. Would you really believe me if I told you? He shot back. He had a point. There wasn't anything he could tell me that I'd readily accept. This entire experience had challenged my most fundamental understanding of the universe. All of those horror films I'd seen over the course of my life, and all of the superstitious nonsense people believed. How could any of it be true? I think my mind's a bit more open, given the circumstances, I grudgingly replied. Good. Truth is, I don't know much of anything about this stuff. My father and grandfather knew a lot more, but they've been gone a long time. If you can get back here and talk about all this in person, I want you to see a friend of mine. Her mom knew my grandfather and I trust her. Her name's Angela. She's only a couple hours drive from you guys, I think. Can she help us? I asked. It's not like that, he said, careful not to get my hopes up. I just want her opinion, that's all. I'll speak to her. Maybe she can come to you. We discussed the matter a bit further, and I eventually said I'd have to defer to Faye. She already felt that I was treating her like a mental patient under careful observation, and she'd be pissed to have a stranger in our home, even if the woman was trying to help. Breaching that topic would be a small bore. I'd have to choose the moment carefully. Toei accepted my judgment and told me to reach out to Angela as soon as I got clearance from Faye. He bade me farewell and reminded me again to never waver in my devotion to my fiancé. His last words to me were, "But don't get so caught up in protecting her that you forget. She's protecting you, too." Saturday finally rolled around. In the days since Faye had returned to a semi-normal state of mind, I was able to catch up on a ton of work. Now, I plan to spend today completely severed from the mountains of books and research articles that cramped my office up on campus. I even closed my door to the guest room, blocking the view of my desk with all the grueling work I'd come to associate with it. Faye and I spent the afternoon in our pajamas, lying all over each other on the couch and watching the X-Files. We made it up to season 6 before our visit to the cabin, but today was the first day she felt like resuming. In one episode we watched, a strange creature made of soil roams a quiet neighborhood, brutally murdering anyone who disobeys the rules of the homeowners association. When I was a kid, my stepfather was an X-Files fanatic, and he would let me watch the show with him after my mom went to sleep. I don't remember much of the storyline, but this particular monster terrified me and plagued my dreams for years afterward. Because of its composition, it was nearly impossible to see, and only seemed to have any substance at all when it only moved, and its wet body glistened under the streetlights. The monster could travel any distance at will, collapsing into a heap of dirt and popping up out of the ground somewhere else. But the thing that scared me the most was that it always knew where to find its victims, and never stopped hunting them. Watching the episode now sent chills up my body, so I abruptly turned it off. "What'd you do that for?" Faye protested. I sat up so I could look into her eyes. She burrowed her feet beneath my thigh to keep her toes warm. "How about something happy?" I said. She flashed a coy smile. "You've got me. I'm your happy." "Oh yeah?" I said, rolling my eyes. "You're a freaking barrel of fun." What about a happy memory?" she said, prodding my knee with her foot. "You mean like the time in college when you went to visit Becca and I had our apartment to myself for 8 days?" Faye drove the heel of her foot at my crotch. I blocked it just in time. "Even happier," she threatened. I laid my head back on the couch and gazed up at the ceiling, trying to think. "Milkshakes," I said. "In senior year, when we'd get all dressed up and go downtown to the burger place." Faye smiled. She withdrew her foot from its attack position. "I remember how cold it was on those nights," I added. "I always wanted you to eat cold stuff, so you'd want me to put my arm around you on the walk back to campus. Worked every time." "Sly dog," Faye said. She blew me a kiss. I pretended to dodge it and then watched in relief as it drifted past. "What about you? The memory, I mean." "Well, we went out to the Stoner Meadow one night," she replied, "back when we were just getting to know each other." "Porter Meadow," I said, cracking up. A bunch of goofy memories from junior year flooded my mind. I'd never shared them with Faye. "We broke off from the group and just looked at the stars," she said. I recall a rather spirited exchange of creepy stories. "I wanted to kiss you that night. That was the first time I thought about it." "Why didn't you?" Faye ran her foot up my chest and poked my chin with her toe. "Because your face looks like that." I pretended to wipe a tear from my eye. She was delighted with herself. Just seeing Faye's smile lit me up inside. It gave me hope that no matter what terrible or tragic things befell us in life, we'd always weather them together. "I still dream of you," she added. "Oh yeah?" "Oh yeah. Sometimes they're about when we first met. Sometimes about the future. I say us with a little boy." "You know," I replied, "I actually think I'd like to have a little tiny Faye running around here someday." She laughed. Her hand found mine. "Then again, I can barely handle you," I said. "Don't know how I'd manage." She gazed up at me for a long moment. Her big green eyes moved over me, like she was trying to take in a memory before leaving on a trip. "I still dream of you," she said again. For 4 days, Faye had slept soundly all through the night. She didn't report a single nightmare, and I hadn't heard any strange noises outside, or inside, for that matter. Privately, I fear that whatever or whoever was tormenting Faye had not given up. Instead, I worried that this was a mere interlude before an onslaught of new horrors, and in the wee hours of the fourth night, my suspicions were realized. I was awoken by the feeling of someone sitting down at the far end of the bed. The mattress sank and pulled my foot with it, instantly setting off the siren in my head that wailed, "Faye's up, grab her before she falls down the stairs." But when I opened my eyes, I noticed the tangled mess of blankets and limbs that was Faye, fast asleep beside me. Someone else was sitting on the bed. It took me a second to make out the pale, withered hand that clutched her wrist. My eyes moved up the long arm and perceived the shape of a bony man, sitting with his back turned to me. His shoulder blades and ribs jutted painfully from his body, and the skin looked stretched over him like dried leather. A black and shaggy mane of hair dangled from his head and obscured his face, but I could see that he was leaned over Faye, examining her with predatory intent. He whispered long strings of words I could not fully hear, but the hateful way that they were enunciated told me enough. He seemed to be giving her a vile command. She lay there motionless, smiling every few seconds as if listening to a slew of comforting promises. I bolted upright, ready to tackle the man, but the second I moved, he issued a slow growl. It rolled up deep inside him, like the warning snarl of a tiger, and snapped the courage right out of me. He dove to the floor and wiggled his way underneath the bed. I screamed for Faye to wake up and threw the sheets from my body, trying to get a light switch near the bedroom door. Before I could reach it, the impact of something heavy against my shoulder blinded me with pain. I rubbed my face and looked around. Bright light stung my eyes. The sun burned through the curtains and lit up the whole room. Everything was sideways. I was twisted up in a bedsheet, lying in the heap on the floor. Faye looked down at me from the bed, shocked at my appearance. "I sleepwalked, dude," she said, lips curling into a smile. "Even when my eyes are closed, I know how to get out of a friggin' bed." "He was here," I said, shrugging off her jab. "I saw him." "Who?" "Him," I said, scowling at her. "He went under there." I reached a tingling hand toward the bed skirt and yanked it up. There was nothing but a few pairs of shoes. "Guess bad dreams are contagious," she said, half joking. Faye sighed. She knew, just as I did, that we weren't through the hurricane yet. We had simply been drifting through the lull of its eye. I hoisted myself from the ground and plopped onto the bed. My side of it was drenched in sweat. "Tell me who he is, Faye," I said with defeat. "Please." Her eyes narrowed in offense. "If I knew," she said, slapping a lock of hair away from her face. "Why the hell would I hide it from you?" "Then tell me what he wants. You must know. Every time you go to sleep, he's right there talking to you. Just tell me what he says." Faye leaned back on her pillow and gazed up at the ceiling. Her eyes sparkled like little green gems in the morning light. "It's always hard to remember," she offered. "It's like fog or static. He wants to know things, but he wants me to forget that he asked." "What does he ask?" "Stuff about my family, my childhood, what I like, what I hate, what I want. He always asks weird things, like who I played with as a little girl, or which of my parents I like best." She looked up at me, "And he wants to know all about you. So many questions." "What do you tell him?" I asked, combing her hair with my fingers. It covered the pillow in a fountain of golds and reds. "I try not to say anything," Faye replied. She swallowed hard. "But sometimes he wears me down, tricks me, makes me think I'm having a conversation with my dad or even Becca. He knows your name now, and a little bit about us." I shuddered. The thought of some intangible husk lurking around in the dark, trying to get to know us profoundly, creeped me out. "Do you ever ask him anything? Does he tell you anything about himself?" "Never." I cupped her cheek, pulling her gaze toward me. "Why does he want to know all this stuff, Faye? What does it matter to him?" She got out of bed and wrapped a little robe around herself, then headed for the hallway. I think one of us has something he wants. One moment, please, while I check my Discord pings. Alright, we're good. Whatever it was that our uninvited guest desired, he was having a lot of trouble finding it. He seemed committed to darkening our home until he got what he came for. Something struck me as I looked at Faye. When she tied her robe, I watched her hands, and I realized she hadn't been wearing her engagement ring for several days. Only now did I realize that she hadn't even worn it out to dinner last week. Faye never leaves our house without it. When I brought it up with her at breakfast, she dismissed the idea that it was lost and assured me that it was in a pocket in her suitcase. I reluctantly accepted this explanation. I couldn't remember the last time Faye misplaced her car keys, let alone an expensive ring. She was also one of the slowest unpackers in the world, and I knew for a fact that the luggage in our hall closet was only half empty. During that conversation, I almost brought up Tuwei's request to have his friend Angela visit us. At the last moment, I held my tongue, reasoning that there was probably a better time to bring it up. Faye was a very headstrong person, and although I admired her confidence, she was quick to interpret my concerns as accusations that she could not manage her own problems. Having someone come check on her would certainly injure her pride and cause a fight. It would have to wait, but I made a mental note to check her suitcase for the ring. I barely had any friends, and as a graduate student, I had virtually no time to spend with the ones I had. The only people I ever saw were the other students in my cohort. Aside from the shared misery of a PhD program, we didn't have much in common. Whenever they weren't working, they were getting blind drunk at bars downtown. Even when I showed up to their pint nights, I was always sober introvert who, with a root beer, totally excluded from the festivities. Tonight, however, they invited me to go out for pizza, and I desperately wanted to go. I needed to get away from the house, which was beginning to feel more and more like purgatory. Surprisingly, Faye encouraged me to get out of the house and unwind. I promised to be home before she fell asleep. It would be the first night since her sleeping pills ran out, so I privately worried that something might happen. In fact, I dreaded it. Faye could read me like an open book and knew what I was thinking, so she grabbed my face and promised she'd be fine, then kissed me and shoved me out the door. It was great to see everyone. They were all in high spirits, celebrating the passage of another punishing week, and seemed glad to see me. I fought back my desire to tell them all about the awful things Faye and I had been through, and they already thought that I was a bit weird for being a teetotaler, and tales of shadow men and dream catchers would surely make me look insane. That evening, I pretended that my life was completely normal, and for the first time in a long time, it almost felt true. I pulled into our neighborhood just before 11:30 p.m. The moment I pushed open the door, I knew something was wrong. Every light in the house was off, including the cable box. Someone had unplugged it. The air was cold, and the memory of the freezing wind on Pale Peak bolted through me. I scolded myself for having lost track of time. "Babe?" I called out. "Maybe it's a power outage." I looked over my shoulder at the rest of the housing complex. Several windows glowed and all the street lights were on. I moved inside, cautious not to trip over anything. My hand ran along the wall until I found a light switch, and when I flicked it on, the living room was empty before me. A water glass lay on the floor, and a big pool of water soaked the carpet. Just beside it rested a large notebook, splayed open to a page filled with harsh scribblings. I scooped it up. This was the dream journal that Dr. Farmer had encouraged Faye to keep. For a brief moment, I hesitated, partly because I didn't want to invade her privacy and partly because I feared what I'd find there. But a dark curiosity took hold. The page, looking up at me, had two styles of handwriting. Near the top, a neat and methodical script ran across the lines in perfect order. A much stranger, more frantic scrawl crowded every inch of the bottom, written lighter and faster than before. Words and letters collided with each other. Some sentences were written over others. It bore resemblance to Faye's handwriting, but almost seemed as though Faye were holding the pencil with a looser grip, the way a sleeping person might. Most of the lines scribbled dreams and were dry observations in shorthand. I'm on a beach in a place I don't recognize. The sand is white, and there are rock formations jutting out of the water. A storm approaches on the horizon. I'm alone. It's night, and I'm thirsty. I try to walk to the kitchen, but I trip and fall into a huge black hole in the floor. At the bottom, there's a pool of things that looks like human crocodile hybrids. The sounds of splashing and thrashing wake me up and end the dream. I'm very young, maybe 4 or 5. I'm with my mom at a restaurant. We're eating ice cream. When I look out the window, there's a giant obelisk sitting inexplicably in the parking lot. It's made from black stone, and there are strange carvings all over it. Everyone is afraid, and they're trying to ignore it. I've seen the statue in other dreams before. The other handwriting was almost poetic and reminded me a bit of the strange babble we'd heard at the cabin. Child, don't wander too far out. They'll get you once they know. They pray you'll every warning doubt and meet them in the snow. 1 was old and sullen skin, 2 was very small, 3 was watching over them, and 4 was none at all. What is your name? Tell me yours first. What makes 5? What makes 5? Littered across the subsequent pages were disturbing sketches, no doubt snapshots from Faye's dreams. I could barely make sense of them, but their expert artistry, I knew that she must have been awake when creating them. They were drawn in colored pencil, her favorite medium. The first depicted a stormy bay with half a dozen ships floating in it. The ships appeared ancient with gigantic masts and wooden hulls. Every one of them was on fire. Tall creatures, maybe demons, were throwing themselves on the decks into the water. From the next page, a little girl was standing on her bed. A grotesque monster was seated next to her with its mouth wide open. The girl was reaching her hand down its throat into a cross-section of its stomach where a crucifix necklace rested. Sharp fangs lined the monster's mouth, ready to bite off the girl's arm. The next picture showed a little boy walking toward the viewer. He held his arms open as if approaching for a hug, but his fingers were elongated and became razor wires that stretched across the breadth of the drawing. He had a cheery grin plastered on his face. Next was a bird in a cage, looking up at an enormous shadow that loomed on the nearby wall. The shadow reached its featureless arms across the ceiling and down another wall toward a distant bed, where a man and woman were sleeping. Next was a snowy forest, not unlike the one visible from the cabin. A figure stood in the shadows. He appeared to be facing away, pointing up to something in the trees. The entire image was framed from a window, as though the viewer were inside the house, looking out. The last image had the same window and forest as the one before, but this time the figure was absent. Instead, a clawed hand was reaching up to the window from the outside, scratching the number 5 onto the glass. There were more pages of writing beyond that, and a loud bang from upstairs tore my attention away from the journal. Something heavy had fallen up there. The entire ceiling above me rumbled and creaked. Then the pitter-patter of quick footsteps resounded across the ceiling. Faye? I called, heading up the stairs. As I neared the top, she darted past me. Faye had been in the guest room and was now making her way toward our bedroom. The way she moved solicited a very loud Jesus Christ right out of my mouth. She trotted high on the balls of her feet, as she had done once before, and staggered around awkwardly, as though her legs and spine were made out of cement. Her neck and arms, however, flopped around like noodles with every jerky movement. Faye stormed into the bedroom and stopped abruptly. Then she drew in a raspy breath, whirled around and peered at me. Her eyes were open and rolled up so only the whites of them showed, but the subtle movements of her head told me she knew I was there, and somehow she was studying me. She flashed an eerie smile and sucked in another breath through gritted teeth, then charged down the hall, laughing as she went. I watched the spectacle from the staircase, unable to command my legs to move. Faye ran past me 4 or 5 times before I could tear my eyes away from her. Eventually my gaze moved from her to the hall window just in front of me. Something moved out there. It was the man. He flailed and jerked and staggered at the edge of the tree line, moving parallel to it. This time, he was actually a few feet out of the woods. The moon was just a silver now and barely illuminated him, but I could see how long and gangly his limbs were. What looked like a filthy dress shirt clung to his misshapen body, and the thick mane of hair that I'd seen in my dreams hung from his head. He began singing. Only the voice that came out of his mouth was that of a small child. Faye ran past me again. The person outside moved with her. Their movements were synchronized. I gasped and stumbled backward. I'd have plummeted down the stairs and snapped my neck, but Faye's hand shot out and caught me by the shirt. She pulled me toward her with inhuman strength and held me tightly as I regained my balance. Her hands ran up my chest and neck, onto my cheeks. They moved across my features, poking and cupping, and the ominous whites of her eyes drilled into me curiously. The smile fell off of her face. "Faye," I said, grabbing her by the shoulders. It's me. Wake up." But she didn't wake up. Her breathing became more rapid and heavy until the air wheezed in and out of her between gnashing teeth. As her fingers painted a picture of my appearance in her mind, her expression changed from confused to terrified. She began shrieking at the top of her lungs, and her hands shook so violently that they rattled against my face. "What the hell's the matter with you?" I shouted. "Faye!" She backed up against the window and held her arms defensively, trying to protect herself from whoever she thought I was. As I moved to comfort her, she slipped past me and dashed away into the bedroom. The man outside darted off too, withdrawing into the forest. I barreled down the stairs and practically broke down the front door. The complex was dead as usual, spare the few neighbors who peeked out their windows to see what all the commotion was about. I ignored them and sprinted across the meadow toward the woods. Tall blades of grass licked my skin. The sounds of frightened little critters scurrying away rang out all around me. It was nearly impossible to see inside the grove. Whoever was in there could surely see me, though, and I felt naked just standing there looking in. Memories of the woman who tried to coax me into the woods at the cabin popped into my head, but I drowned them out with thoughts of Faye and stepped inside. Darkness enveloped me. A branch cracked somewhere to my left, leaves crunched. A billowing shadow ducked behind a nearby tree. I only recognized the shape after it moved. "Hey!" I shouted, making my way toward it. "Get back here, you son of a bitch!" I tried to pursue the dark form, but it deftly snaked between the trees. Branches battered my head and chest as I followed, and the hard roots that jutted from the earth caught my shoes. In mere moments, the figure had vanished, and I found myself wandering around the dark, alone. The street lamps of the neighborhoods surrounding the grove whirled around me. I trudged through the woods in defeat, entertaining crazy thoughts of leaving Faye and moving somewhere else. My hope was nearly smashed, and my partner was not going to get better without a miracle or some serious medical intervention. Both possibilities seemed more and more distant with each passing day. Faye was going to end up in a filthy asylum, and I would too if I corroborated anything she said. This man, this thing, wasn't going to stop until one of us was dead. In my mournful reveries, I had lost track of the way out of the grove. I looked up just in time to dodge a huge spider web that loomed right at face level. I stood up to regard the thing and realized it wasn't a web at all. It was a dream catcher. This one had no ragged twine in the center. The material was much finer and glimmered in the twilight. For a moment, I stared into it, nearly hypnotized by the way it gently swayed and twirled in place. "Is that hair?" I reached out and plucked the thing from the branch. It was ice cold to the touch. The second I removed it, a powerful gust of wind rushed the grove and set all the trees shivering. As I carried the object back to the house, a terrible feeling grew in the pit of my stomach with each step, weighing me down as I moved. I had to know what this thing was made of. I examined the thing under a streetlight. I instantly recognized the strawberry gold color that wove a pattern in the dream catcher's center. It was Faye's. In silent rage, I tore the thing apart and heaved it into the bushes of our lawn. There was no will left inside me to try to make sense of it anymore. I held back tears of frustration and returned to the bedroom. Faye was sleeping peacefully. For hours, I lay motionless in bed, but no rest came to me. All of the terrible things I had seen haunted my mind, the images from Faye's dream journal, the wicked way she moved, the terrible man who shrouded our every step. Something about that drawing of the window kept popping into my head over and over. It showed the view of the woods outside the cabin, but the window framed itself was the wrong color. I recognized it from somewhere else. Then I remembered Faye running in and out of the guest room. She almost never went in there for fear of messing up my workspace. All of the research materials were scattered across that room in an organized chaos that only I could navigate. Faye didn't even bother going in there during her compulsive cleaning projects. But the window in that room, it had a perfect view of the grove across the street, where the man always stood. I got out of bed and walked down the dreary hall. There was nothing to see outside. The woods I'd just stumbled through were faintly visible in the gloom, but if a strange figure lurked within them, I could not tell. The breeze had died down and nothing moved at all. The neighbors I disturbed had long since gone to bed. No lights glowed in any of their windows. I moved my face closer to the glass. My breath fogged it and obscured the view. A finger-drawn line appeared in the wispy condensation. Puzzled, I breathed in the glass again, illuminating more of it this time. It was the number 5 drawn backwards. I traced over it with my finger, trying to understand what it meant. Then I realized Faye had written a message that could be read by someone standing outside. "What makes 5? I muttered, recalling Faye's dream journal. In the distance, a child began to sing. Okay, I'm gonna do one more chapter. I'm not a fucking science project, Felix. Faye was pissed as I anticipated. She threw the couch pillow to the floor and put the TV on mute. It was morning and she already was in a bad mood because earlier I had made the mistake of trying to explain last night's events. The words tore her up, so I stopped halfway through. I figured he might be, open to the idea. I pointed to the screen. Mulder and Scully were engaged in a heated argument. I was surprised to see her watching the X-Files, given our current situation. "Why has nobody asked me what I want to do?" she said, staring daggers at me. "Because you don't want to do anything," I snapped. "You want to pretend none of this shit ever happened. And each day you get worse. You vanish, Faye. It's like you just disappear for hours at a time. You're gone. Do you even know where you go?" I expected Faye to really let me have it, but she gazed up at me with a mixture of hurt and acknowledgement. "I just want to go back to the way things were," I said, softening my voice. "I want you to be okay. It's like I'm slowly losing you to some other guy, but this guy wants to wear you as a fucking suit." Faye cracked up. She flashed a glittering smile at me, then quickly buried it under a blank expression. For a moment we just looked at each other. Then she reached her arms out to me. I had dropped into her and got swallowed up in a tight hug. "I miss you," I said, breathing her in. "What else can we do? If we go back to the hospital, this time they'll lock you up. They'll hook you up to a bunch of machines and diodes, stick needles in you, take more blood, lots more. You're gonna get committed. I'd rather try this first. Please work with me on this, Faye." She kissed me and ran her fingers through my hair. Her eyes moved over mine, studying me, seeing within the honest desire to pull her back from the brink of whatever darkness she was slipping into. "Come back to me, Monkey Toes," I said. "Please, I need you back." Faye wiped a tear from her eye before it could fall. "Okay," she said. "I'll talk to her, for you." Angela arrived at our home by late afternoon and was just as warm and friendly as Taway. Her hair was straight and black with a sprinkling of gray. It framed a lean face with 2 green eyes just like Faye's, and although she can be reserved around new people, Faye instantly took a liking to our guest. Within minutes, they were complimenting each other's hair. "So how do you know Taway?" Faye asked. I dragged a chair to the living room while the two sat next to each other on the couch. "He and I go way back," Angela said with an ill-concealed grin. "I suspected they were more than friends once upon a time. When we were kids, we lived next to each other on the reservation. His grandfather was a tribal elder, and he gave lessons on our people's language to me and my mother. There's a big effort to preserve native languages now, you know." "That's amazing," Faye said. "Can you speak it?" Angela hesitated. "It's been years since I've practiced," she replied. "After my mom passed, I came out to California. Some members of my family are still upset with my decision, so I never had anyone to speak it with." "Faye left Colorado to come here as well," I offered. "You've got something in common then." Angela put her hand on Faye's and smiled. "Nahepa." she said. I don't know how to pronounce that correctly. Forgive me if I pronounced it incorrectly. It can mean friend or sister, depending on how you use it. When we arrived at Pale Peak, we bought a magazine at the airport, I said. It mentioned something about how Indian, native languages are dying. Faye glared at me. Angela noticed and laughed. It's all right, she said, patting Faye's hand. Most people don't read a dang thing about us. There's been some debate over how we should identify ourselves. Until recently, it was considered taboo to call us Indians, since the Europeans who called us that thought they were in India. But some communities embrace this name. Others prefer the term native, for obvious reasons. I'm fine with either. The term indigenous is used in universities because it describes people who first inhabited the land in any place, not just the United States. Heck, the natives of Canada are sometimes called First People. And yes, my ancestral language is spoken by fewer and fewer people. This has been happening for hundreds of years. For a long time, people like me were taken from our nations and forced into schools where we learned English or Spanish and adopt European ways of life. The settlers wanted us to forget our cultures and spiritual traditions, wanted us to be more like them, you see. So whole generations of natives grew up without ever hearing their own languages, and now very few of us speak them anymore. In fact, there are many languages that have been totally lost. Faye and I exchanged sad looks. The words "I'm sorry" welled up in my mouth, but it would have been a paltry thing to say. I regretted bringing up the subject. Angela noted our silence and rescued us. I came out here to study these issues at the university rather than remain with my community, and that's why I'm at odds with some members of my family. Thankfully, Tue has always been there for me, the old goat. He's quite a guy, I said. I didn't mean to make you sit here and explain all this to us. I hope don't even, she replied, silencing me with a hand. Some don't like talking about it. I do. That's my choice. We nodded. But here I am, droning on, she continued, when I really came to listen. Faye, do you mind telling me a little about yourself? Faye glanced at me again and cleared her throat. She likely wanted to gauge how honest she should be about our situation. Well, she said, taking a nervous breath, I'm 26, I've got a degree in biology, and I've got one sister. Hi, welcome to the chat. Happy to have you here. I'm in the middle of reading a horror book that I love. Angela seemed disappointed with Faye's response. She turned to me. Faye flashed me an I don't know shrug. Felix, tell me about her. I figured Angela wanted to learn who my fiancé was beneath the surface. Faye was a complicated universe of great and terrible wonders, and always tried to hide her real personality from the world. She's a remorseless chocolate addict, I said, scowling playfully at Faye. Stubborn as a damn mule. Occasionally homicidal, especially when she sleepwalks, but she's hilarious. Always knows how to cheer me up. She's the only person who's ever really appreciated me, so I keep her around. Both of them laughed and glanced at each other. Faye rolled her eyes. She doesn't forgive easily, I added, especially when it comes to forgiving herself. She pushes herself in everything she does. Such a perfectionist. She doesn't even realize that she's already perfect. Angela smiled a knowing smile and nodded. Guess I should have asked you first, she said. We talked for an hour or so. The conversation meandered around our relationship and eventually focused on Faye's tendency to sleepwalk in times of stress. Angela was fascinated, so we gave her the rundown of all the funny things Faye did at night when we first started dating. Finally, we arrived at the story of our vacation to Pale Peak. Faye hesitated. Angela sensed that we were reluctant to talk for fear that she'd not believe us. Look, she said, Tue already told me a little bit about this. You can share whatever you're comfortable sharing, and I promise to keep an open mind. Sometimes I come off as a bit stuffy, but that's just from years of teaching. She patted Faye's hand again. I have a spiritual side too, you know. He doesn't, Faye said, motioning at me. He will, Angela replied. I took it as a lighthearted joke, but her voice was so flat it almost sounded like a threat. Faye remained silent for a few moments, no doubt collecting all the fragments of our trip that she'd scattered and buried in her memory. She told the story in its entirety, from our arrival at the cabin all the way up until this very moment. I jumped in occasionally to corroborate her claims to offer my own interpretation of the event, and I filled in the gaps of what happened when she was sleepwalking. The one element I left out was the new dream catcher just outside of our home. I couldn't burden Faye with any more bad news, but I did admit that I rummaged through her dream journal and that she'd drawn a backwards 5 on the window. Angela's expression grew more and more horrified as we proceeded down the list of terrible things we'd suffered. Her questions became fewer and farther in between until she was utterly silent, staring back at us with a colorless face. "Faye," she said at last, leaning back against the couch and taking a measured breath. "This man who visits you, has he told you his name?" "No, I've asked." Angela stood up. Her eyes moved around the room, searching for something. "May I have a look around upstairs?" The three of us headed to the second floor hall. "That's our bedroom down there," I said, pointing to the left, "and the guest room's over here." Angela seemed more interested in the windows than the rooms. She wandered around the top floor of the house, gazing out each window for several seconds. Her eyes always moved to the grove across the street. "His voice," she said, fixated on the trees. "Does it sound like the wind?" Faye crossed her arms and shuddered. "Yes," Faye said, nodding at the window. "He waits until I fall asleep, waits until I'm dreaming." "Is this where he stands?" Angela asked. "We've both seen him," I said, putting my arm around Faye. "At the cabin, out the kitchen window. I've seen him out here, too. I think he even came to the door one night." Faye looked up at me with fear in her eyes. Up until this point, she probably thought the figure outside was only visible to her in her dreams. "Oh, yes," Angela replied, voice low and dreary. "He'd wait right down there by the front door, whisper to your fiancé for hours and hours." Faye pushed herself away from me and left the bedroom. "What does he want?" I asked. "Faye says he just asks about all kinds of random stuff. It doesn't make any sense." Angela traced something down the window with her finger, then took a step back and regarded it. "Did she say she talks to him? If she told him anything?" "A little," I replied. "What does it matter? Who is he?" Angela turned and walked back into the hall, looking at the window out there. Still trying to retain some level of skepticism about this, I mentioned that Faye had drawn a 5 on the glass here, and I believed it was a signal to the man outside. What I said was true, except for the fact that I'd intentionally chosen the wrong window. Angela studied it for a few moments and then walked to the staircase. As she passed by the guest room, she said, "Something about that room feels really off. I think that's where she lets him in." Faye was downstairs and on the couch, wrapped up in the blanket. She looked pale and exhausted, as if ready to disappear again for another few hours. I moved the chair closer to her and put my hand on her forehead. "You have to take this with a grain of salt, you guys," Angela said, sitting down at the couch. "I'm not really sure what I think of this stuff. I go back and forth every day. On the drive here, I was a skeptic, but I'm leaving as one of the devout. Who knows what I'll be tomorrow? School and life in California have turned me to stone, and I still get those old feelings. I got them here, in your home. They're not quite visions, but they're something. Toy makes fun of me when I get them. He calls me a daydream atheist." I laughed. This whole experience had certainly made me into a believer, if only late at night. "He won't tell us anything," I said. "I've tried asking." "Our beliefs are a very private thing," she replied. "But given your circumstances, I think Toei wants to make an exception, and I agree with him. Faye, your family has visited Pale Peak over the years, right?" Faye nodded. "My people tell a lot of stories about the mountain," Angela went on. Like any old place, there are legends and folk tales about things that happened long ago. Unfortunately, Pale Peak has a terrible history, and most of our stories are sad or scary. It would take a long time to explain how the creator and the soul work in my culture, so I'll try to say it like this. There are a lot of magical beings in our oldest stories. Most are manifestations of the earth, or the spirits of ancestors and those who have passed on before us. But what you both are telling me reminds me of another creature. This one doesn't come from the world of the dead, but somewhere else, farther beyond it. I don't exactly know how to translate this name for you. You could call these creatures, the Hollow Ones. They're jealous of living things, the joy of this world, jealous of sunlight. They have none of it." Faye shifted in her seat. Sweat glistened on her brow. Why us? She asked. Why me? I don't know, Angela replied. The legend says they try to coax children and gullible people into the dark with them, take them away. I don't know how much more than that. I tried not to scoff at the exchange. It was still light enough outside that the analytical part of my brain hadn't surrendered yet. Okay, I interjected. Let's just say this thing is real. What do we do now? How do we get rid of it? I don't know. But Tawai said you know this stuff better than he does. I know frauds better than he does, Angela corrected. Another awkward silence fell. Angela looked down at her lap, deep in thought. Have you lost anything important? Faye burrowed her hands under the blanket. Like what? The story I remember tells of a boy who goes into the woods looking for pine nuts. He carries a pouch, one that his grandmother made for him. The boy hears strange noises all around him and gets scared. As he runs back home, he trips and drops the pouch. When he and his father go to retrieve it that evening, they see a man squatting on the ground sniffing the pouch. The man then turns around and speaks to the boy in his grandmother's voice. The boy and his father escape, but the man stands outside their home every night, calling out to the boy in familiar voices, begging him to come outside. What happened to him? Faye asked. The rest isn't important, Angela said. It's just a scary story, that's all. But come on, do you really believe this stuff? I asked. I mean, for God's sake, Faye's Catholic. This isn't the kind of thing we can talk to her priest about. Angela sighed. I instantly knew I'd hit a sore spot. Just stop talking, I thought to myself. Like I said, she responded, there are two halves that makes me whole. One is the girl who grew up practicing our spiritual tradition and who still feels a duty to uphold those beliefs. The other is the adult who experiences the world on its surface, who hasn't had a sense for the supernatural in decades. The believer and the atheist live inside me together. I think it's like that for a lot of people, Faye offered. Angela spoke with us for a few more minutes, and then we parted ways. As I walked her to her car, she looked again at the tree line across the street and back at me. There's a dark cloud hanging over both of you, especially Faye, she said. If this truly is a hollow one, I don't know what he wants, but he's not here to make friends. Her words filled me with dread. I just stared back at her. Don't listen to it. Don't talk to it. And don't leave her alone with it. I'm sorry, Felix. I wish I knew how to help. As soon as Faye went to bed, I headed straight for the closet with our luggage. As I suspected, her engagement ring was nowhere to be found. There was little doubt in my mind that she had left it at the cabin, or worse, lost it in the snow. The likelihood of never getting it back crushed me, but the feeling was swiftly replaced with a mental image of that creature wandering around in the forest, sniffing it with glee. That night, Faye sat up in bed, waking me in the process. As she tried to stand, I grabbed her by the arm and yanked her right back down. Nope, I said, pulling her close and wrapping her in a tight hug from behind. Sleep now. Faye rolled toward me too, and so our noses touched. Her eyes were open and rolled back into her head. She smiled and ran a fingernail across my cheek, pretending to carve ribbons of flesh. She reminded me of a butcher delicately assessing a fillet. They're gonna kill you, she whispered, then licked my face. Alright, we are about halfway through this book. We are gonna stop for tonight, because I am out of time, so I'm gonna go to just chatting and switch over to my more fun music. So, thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this stream. It's been a while since we've read that. Still love that book so much, so we're getting into it. We know the name of the thing, we know what's going on, so a couple things. If you guys want to join my Discord, you'll be getting direct updates on my tweets when I go live, and be in a community with a bunch of other people who are part of this channel. So I would highly recommend going to check that out. I'm in there. I do try to chat with you guys here and there when you guys say something, so it's a lot of fun. And yeah, so thank you guys so much for watching. We're gonna see if there's any friends that It's that one. Yes. Anyway, we're gonna see if there's any friends we can raid today. But while I'm doing that, if you guys are watching on YouTube, please consider subscribing if you enjoyed. It takes 2 seconds and it's completely free, so you can always unsubscribe later. Hang on, my Twitch is being a little silly. Tomorrow night at FQR is streaming, so we're gonna raid her. So thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed. Tomorrow night at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, we are going to be starting Undertale for the very first time. I've never ever played Undertale, so we're gonna start playing that on stream. So thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you guys in the next one. Bye, guys.